Here, my presentation will be about codec options in IPMX and when you should use each option. So a quick introduction about IPMX. IPMX really aims at covering a wide set of devices. It's really designed from the get-go to be the Swiss knife for AV and production. And therefore, it needs to cover a wide range of use cases, and each of those use cases really put different constraints. And therefore, you have to design the specifications for those different use cases. So for example, in an IPMX network, you might find some professional production equipment, such as production switchers, cameras, but also some AV signal routing systems, so typically HDMI encoders and decoders, but also more IT-centric infrastructure. So it can be professional IT infrastructure, such as servers, but also more end-user IT infrastructure, such as laptops and workstations. And with all of those devices, you've got different specifications, and you've got to design the specifications so that you can implement IPMX on those devices. And within those devices, video is really the limiting factor. That's what puts the most constraints on the device. Because when it comes to routing and control, for example, as Rob said, NMOS is really a must-have and is really a simple solution in the sense that it's been deployed a lot and it doesn't take that much network bandwidth and doesn't take much processing power. Audio is also true for audio. Audio over IP has been there for a long time. It takes bandwidth, but not as much as what you have with video. Security, encryption, and the HDCP, these are all things where you can have a common solution with PEP and HCAP in the case of IPMX. Same goes for remote control and KVM, where you can put USB over IP and you've basically covered the problem. However, with video, you have such a high data rate that is associated. So for example, when you've got a 4K 60 uncompressed feed, you have 12 gigabits of data per second. And that doesn't fit on an Ethernet cable. Like a Cat6e cable, Cat6 cable is 10 gig maximum. So that doesn't fit on any Ethernet cable. And so you have to go for fiber directly with more costly switches, for example, and you cannot go into more IT-centric devices. So you've got some really constraints that are posed with video. So what's the solution to this problem? Well, compression. But the thing is, with compression, it's impossible to find a perfect balance between the different, let's say, requirements that you have with codecs. So you cannot have a very low latency, a very high image fidelity, and a very low device complexity. That doesn't work together. So you kind of have to accept the trade-off and pick and choose based on what are your needs. And so for this reason, multiple video profiles have to be supported if you want IPMX to be the Swiss Army knife of AV. So a quick word about what a codec is, because I'm aware it's pretty specific. Well, the basic idea is that you want to remove any unnecessary data while maintaining the necessary information. So the way it works is that you take some input, you remove what is unnecessary, that's your encode phase, and then you've got the decode phase where you have to get back to that original format that you can actually use. And so how does it work? Well, you have three main stages. The first is decorrelation, where you find and remove redundancies. So that stage is lossless. You can revert back to the original if you only stick to that stage. So if, for example, if you've got a red pixel and another red pixel right nearby, then you can just send the information once and not twice. Then you've got the step of quantization. That's the lossy part. This is where you remove noise and any unnecessary data. So let's say you've got data that is not visible to the naked eye. You can just remove it, and the audience won't notice. And then this last stage is entropy coding, where you assign variable length code depending on how frequent certain data is. So for example, for very frequent data, you will assign a shorter bit length because it's more common. And for less common data, you will assign a longer bit length. And for all of those stages, you've got several compression granularities that are possible. You can look for redundancies within part of a frame. You can look for redundancies within a whole frame. and you can look also for redundancies between frames. And you kind of have to find, there's a cutoff. So you have to decide where you stop looking for redundancies and you start encoding the data. And that cutoff is at the heart of any codec algorithm. So this is part of the work that the Video Services Forum has done. And, there has been an assessment of what are the different categories of codec that are available and what are the technical differences between those. And so based on this report, this is AIMS has defined several video profiles for IPMX. And so we've got first the uncompressed video type, where you really send only raw pixel data information, and therefore you don't add any latency. As soon as you receive a pixel, you start encoding it, and you send it over the network, or you store it. Then you've got some intra-frame codec, which can be subframe or frame-based. And so if it's subframe, the way it works is that you only wait for a few lines of data to start encoding. And therefore, since video works in a rasterizer method, you can just wait for a given number of lines. And once you've received those lines, you can start encoding and sending it over the network. And so you maintain very low latency at the encoding phase and the decoding phase. And so those types of codecs, such as the standard JPEG XS, are spatial codecs, so they don't use any temporal correlation to encode. So therefore, all of the information is contained and independent from one frame to another. Then you've got some interframe codec with a predictive mechanism, where you will use information from previous frames to determine what's the information of the frames that follow. So you can work on the frame basis, but also on a subframe basis there. And if you work on a subframe basis, you've gained a huge amount of quality because you can reuse information from previous frame without adding any latency, because you still be reusing data from the previous frame that you've stored. And so this category of codec is great for content where you have fine details and where quality will build up over time, and therefore it's really mathematically lossless in those static areas at the end after several frames. And so one example is the TDC mode of JPEG XS. And then finally, we've got the interframe types of codecs, so AVC, HEVC, for example. And those codecs look at redundancies across several frames, frames that come before and frames that come after. And that means that you have to wait for those frames to come to start encode and decode. And mechanically, you've added latency because you need to buffer several frames before you can actually store them or send them over the network. And so that means that with those, with these categories, the area of redundancy grows, and therefore you're able to compress more. But since the cutoff, let's say, comes later, you've added more latency. And so that's the trade-off you have. The more you compress, the higher the latency. And so based on this report, AIMS has really defined 4 video profiles that really target the different use cases that IPMX aims at solving. And so you've got first the uncompressed video profile, which is based on 702110-20, which is very common. Then the JPEG XS video profile, the HEVC video profile, and the AVC video profile. And the VSF TR10 document themselves don't specify a specific codec, but since IPMX is about interoperability in practice and not in theory, AIMS has decided to select a few of those codecs and to let's say, stamp them as official profiles. And so if you want to implement an IPMX product, there's a set of basic requirements, but you don't have to pick a specific profile, but you need to pick at least one of them to be IPMX certified. So it can be the audio profile, but also any of the video profile. And crucially, all of those codecs that are selected are all non-proprietary and standardized either at JPEG or MPEG. And that's great for to make them future-proof. So I want to go into a little bit more details about each profile. So first, the uncompressed video profile. Where should you use them? Well, you should use them within IPMX anywhere where you need compatibility with SMPTE 2110-20 production equipment. And so it's great because you don't have any added latency that is due to the compression algorithm. In practice, you've got latency due to the capture and the rendering and the network infrastructure, but you have no latency due to the codec itself. And also, using this profile is great if you want to have frame accurate switching, because all of the information is contained within a specific frame, so you don't need to wait for a few frames before you can switch between streams, for example. And so it's great if you want to interface with high-end broadcaster-grade studios, for example, or if you want to distribute in bandwidth-unconstrained AV environments. And even one thing to consider, though, is even if your network is sized for uncompressed video, the simple fact that you've got such a high data rate on devices means that you cannot have this profile in any kind of device. For example, you will never be able to receive an uncompressed video stream on a standard laptop. And that's where the other video profiles come in. And so you've got first the JPEG XS video profile, and it's a great video profile if you want to be compatible with SMPTE 2110-22 production equipment and contribution equipment as well. So it also enables frame-by-frame access, because information is self-contained within a group of lines and not across frames. So that's great if you want to do some switching, instantaneous switching. And so you can use that profile if you want to interface in local area networks, also in wide area networks where TRO8 is being used. That's a specification for JPEG XS within SMPTE 2110. And also in cloud-based workflow where JPEG XS is used as an ingress or as an egress. It can also be used in post-production workflows and any live event distribution where you need synchronization and where you've got latency constraints, such as image magnification, for example. Then I want to talk more about the TDC mode of JPEG XS. That's not a profile, but a profile mode, which is an extension. So it's not mandatory if you adopt the JPEG XS profile, but it brings additional functionalities. This mode brings an additional 50% improvement in compression, and especially on static type of content. So think of Excel spreadsheets, PowerPoint presentation. This kind of content works great with this mode of JPEG XS. And really, it's been designed if you want to fit a 4K 60 content on a 1 gig link, or an 8K 60 content on a 2.5 gig link. That is the codec you would go for if you want to target those use cases. Then we've got the HEVC video profile, which is great if you've got bandwidth-constrained environment and where latency is less critical. So here, compared to the TDC profile of JPEG XS, the algorithm will look for motion between images and not for lack of motion. That means it's great if you want to have some natural content that you want to distribute, but if you've got static content where you've got fine details, it might be less suitable. And here the paradigm is really, okay, let's maximize compression at the expense of latency and algorithmic complexity. What I mean with algorithmic complexity is that it's very hard to implement in software. And the way you would implement this is using existing SoCs that have hardware encoded capabilities to decode and encode this codec. So some of the use cases include, for example, products where you have bandwidth-constrained endpoints. So, for example, if manufacturers want to turn an existing display into an AV over IP endpoint with IPMX, then you've got a very small network interface that isn't able to fit a high bandwidth. So therefore, you would go for that kind of codec. And as I said, for less latency critical AV distribution, or for example, for UC devices which have very simple chips in it and with hard-coded capabilities for H.265, for example. Then we've got the H.264 video profile, which is H.264 solve the same use case as HEVC, but it's a previous generation codec. The reason why it has been adopted in IPMX is that it's really the lingua franca codec on all SoC platforms, on all chips, really. And therefore, you're able to leverage any kind of device that have this accelerated capability. And on those devices, often you don't have enough processing power to go for other options. And so that means that it's therefore the only viable option to turn those devices into an IPMX endpoint. So a quick word about some workflow examples of where those codec and profiles would be suitable. So the first scenario is, let's say you have a mixed production and AV distribution workflow in a corporate space, where you've got a large production facility with existing SMT 2110 equipment, and you've got, for example, a boardroom, and you want to distribute some content in a local area networks in a theater where you're performing, for example, image magnification. Well, in the large production facility, since you've got already SMT 2110-20 equipment, you would probably go for the uncompressed video profile. In the boardroom where you have cameras, you might be constrained by your existing network there. And therefore, a solution like JPEG XS is very suitable if you want to make sure that latency remains very low there. And then when it comes to distribute the content that you've produced in your production facility, you might also want to make sure that content has a very low latency, and also that it fits on a 1 gig link, for example. And therefore, a good choice there would be the TDC profile of JPEG XS, because you would be able to fit that 4K 60 content on that 1 gig link, and while making sure that there's no latency that would make the experience uncomfortable. The second scenario is on the other hand is a scenario where latency is less critical, or where you have a bandwidth constrained environment. There, you could have, for example, a small production studio where you still want to maintain low latency because you want to make sure that you have synchronization and you have more affordable bandwidth in that part of your facility. But you still, the feed you're producing and distributing is not latency critical, and you can have some digital signage player as well in your network. And so the feeds that are produced and casted by the player are not latency critical, and so those feeds can be HEVC or AVC feeds. And so between the two, you've got a whole range of use cases where you can mix and match based on what suits better for you. And what needs to be kept in mind is, in all of those scenarios, you've got a diminishing bandwidth, an increasing latency, and diminishing quality in general. Depends on the content, but that's what you would observe the further right you go. So, in conclusion, why do the profile help IPMX become a reality? Well, those profiles really serve as the basis for interoperability during vendor plugfest, but also on-the-ground deployments. So one example is in April, there was an IPMX tested event in Burbank at the Everts facility, and those profiles were tested on the field that served as the basis layer for interoperability. And so the audio profile, the uncompressed profile, and the JPEG XS profile were all tested. And so those profiles really enable to expand the adoption of IPMX across new industries and new use cases.